Israel has agreed to pause fighting in 3 specific areas of Gaza for 3 days. This is part of a World Health Organization deal to allow for children in Gaza to get vaccinated against polio.
I don't need to tell you how disastrous it would be if we were unable to contain this preventable disease, a disease that knows no borders.
Last week, the UN body confirmed at least 1 baby has been paralyzed by the virus. It's the first case in the territory in 25 years. This comes as violence in the West Bank escalates. Mourners gather in the funeral procession for Palestinians killed by Israeli forces in the West Bank. The Israeli military said it had killed 5 Hamas fighters inside a West Bank mosque, sparking concern that the occupied territory could become a major new front, all while tensions remain high with Hezbollah on Israel's northern border. Thomas Junot is an associate professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Rhonda Sleem is a senior fellow and a director of the Conflict Resolution and Track 2 Dialogues program at the Middle East Institute. Thank you both for your time today. Rhonda Sleem, I'm going to start with you. These humanitarian pauses in fighting are not the more prolonged break that the United Nations hoped to see. What do you make of this agreement?
Well, we'll see if the Israeli authorities will go forward with this agreement. As of earlier today, the Israeli Prime Minister pushed back on the idea of pauses. And I think it might be a question of terminology that he is uncomfortable with vis-a-vis his allies in the right-wing allies in the government. But if it goes through, I think that's in the interest of both Israel and, of course, in the interest of the Palestinians. Let's remember, this is, as you said, this is the first case in 25 years, right? And it's a baby boy who was born during the war, 10-month-old, has not been vaccinated until now. This is the same epidemiological space: Israel, Gaza, West Bank. So any kind of epidemic, any kind of major disease is not going to only affect people in Gaza. It's not going to only affect people in the West Bank. It also can transmit to Israel. So it is in the interest of Israeli authorities to agree to these pauses, to get this vaccination to proceed. But again, time will tell if this is going to happen.
Tama, I want to ask you about the fact that Israel is continuing military operations in the West Bank, which it says are aimed at preventing attacks. What do these operations and Israel's decision to go forward with them tell us about the state of the conflict right now?
Well, we've talked a lot less about the West Bank in the last 10 months because attention has been focused so much on Gaza. But the situation remains very complicated, very tense in the West Bank for a number of reasons, especially now that even though Israeli military operations in Gaza continue, they have been slowing down a bit steadily so that Israel can shift a bit more of its attention to the West Bank. So on the one side, you've got that variable that is changing. There have also been a number of reports in the media and elsewhere in the last months, weeks, but also years that Iran has been increasing its support for Hamas, for Palestinian Islamic Jihad in the West Bank, and that Israel has been very alarmed by this. With attention shifting away from Gaza, with Israel wanting to put more attention on the West Bank, with Iran also thinking along those lines. Add to that another variable in the equation, which is within the coalition government of Prime Minister Netanyahu in Israel, there are far-right elements who have been actively, aggressively supporting settlements in the West Banks, expansion of settlements, growth of settlements, and who have been, encouraging settlers, some of the more extremist elements among the settlers, to harass Palestinians in the West Bank and so on. That has led to a number of incidents of violence between settlers, supported de facto by the police, by the military, and Palestinians in the West Bank. And I could go on for a while, but I think the bottom line is that the situation remains very tense in the West Bank, and there's no reason for that to get any better anytime soon.
Rhonda Sleem, it feels like as this conflict has progressed, we've sort of tried to get this sense of, is there any hope that things are improving? Is there more fear that things are teetering into a broader regional conflict? Certainly that discussion had been amplified in the last few weeks. Where do you think we stand in the prospect of things tipping into something much worse versus calming somewhat?
Look, we came very close to that past weekend when the situation between Israel and Hezbollah escalated, and we had Hezbollah retaliate to the assassination of its senior commander with about 340, rockets sent across the border, tens of drones. Israel did its own, what it claimed is a preemptive strike using, according to its military, 100 fighter jet against X number of targets in Lebanon, Hezbollah. But both sides stepped away from the brink. Each side did what they needed to do, and then they just stepped away from the brink. And the Hezbollah Secretary General said, this episode is done. However, as Thomas said, as the situation in the West Bank escalates, especially if it starts getting close to, religious sites that have important symbolism and are really, extremely important to the Muslims around the world, and you are going to see more and more anger. You are going to see more reluctance in the region to diffuse tensions. You are going to see more increase in tension. And let me add to what Thomas said. I understand Iran sending weapons because there is a milieu that wants to resist. But the real problem, which has been now for decades, is the occupation, is the Israeli occupation of the West Bank. Remember, this occupation is illegal under international law. It has been there for decades. And as long as there is occupation, as long as there is denial of justice to the Palestinians, there will always be tension, there will always be Palestinian resistance, and and peace will be denied. That's the problem. So what needs to happen immediately is a ceasefire. And I don't see much progress taking place on the ceasefire talks taking place in Doha and Egypt, primarily because the Israeli prime minister has tethered his political future, his political gravitas, to the sustainability of this conflict, to the prolongation of this war. And now recently we heard that the Israeli defense minister has requested the Israeli government to expand the aims and the objectives of this war to include now, some kind of a major operation on the border between Lebanon in order to restore order to the northern communities in Israel.
Tama, I do want to get to that question of the prospects of these ceasefire talks. It was Monday, I believe, that White House National Security spokesperson John Kirby pushed back on the idea that the talks were breaking down, saying they were, in fact, in his words, constructive. What is your assessment of whether there is any hope? Because we have to say in the last couple of weeks, the White House was suggesting that there was potentially quite a bit of hope around these talks, of how likely they are to succeed.
Well, the White House has been pretty much alone in expressing any kind of optimism in the last couple of weeks. Either other participants in the talks, Hamas, Israel, or mediators, Egypt, Qatar, or observers, pretty much everybody else has been fairly pessimistic, and unfortunately, I would have to include myself in the pessimistic camp. The dynamics that have led to the absence of a ceasefire, to the absence of any success in these talks for 10 months now, these dynamics have not fundamentally changed. If you want to be very optimistic, if you want to be the glass half full kind of person, and I don't think glass half full is the right term, is glass 10% full, you could say that some indicators are starting to move. And I'm saying that very, very cautiously, keeping in mind that I remain pessimistic. But some of the things that will have to change over time to really see some genuine movement towards a ceasefire and eventually an actual ceasefire, that includes more pressure domestically inside Israel. Polls are increasingly showing support for a ceasefire and a deal to release hostages. As Randa just said, Prime Minister Netanyahu remains bound to a coalition that includes far-right elements that have clearly said if there's a ceasefire, we are leaving the government. And that really ties Netanyahu's hands. That is not changing. That being said, polls are changing a bit. Inside Gaza, inside the Palestinian territories, there are growing reports of discontent towards Hamas. Very hard to quantify because, of course, independent polls are impossible. But Hamas, at some point, will have to be somewhat more responsive to that. In the U.S., pressure is mounting against Israel, and part of Netanyahu's calculus to resist serious talks on a ceasefire was him banking on a President Trump in early 2025. That is still a possibility, but the arrival of candidate Harris as opposed to candidate Biden has perhaps lessened the chances of a President Trump. And at some point, Netanyahu is also going to factor that into the calculation. So bottom line is that I remain pessimistic for the prospects for a ceasefire in the short term, but the pieces that will have to move eventually to lead us towards a ceasefire are maybe starting to cautiously move.
Okay. Appreciate the analysis from both of you today. Thank you very much, Thomas Junot and Randa Saleem.